Settle in, let your shoulders drop, let your eyes soften, and let go of whatever today asked of you. You don't have to do anything for the next few hours except listen and drift and let your mind wander back to a muddy field in upstate New York more than half a century ago. Tonight, we're going back to August of 1969 to 3 days that were supposed to be a modest little concert on a dairy farm and instead became one of the most mythologized weekends in American history. You've heard the postcard version: peace signs, flower crowns, 500,000 people swaying together in perfect harmony. Some of that is true, a lot of it isn't. Tonight we're going to sit with what actually happened at Woodstock, the parts that made it into the highlight reel, and the parts that got quietly left out. Before we get there, two small things. If you're enjoying this kind of slow, immersive history, consider subscribing. It helps this channel keep making these long, quiet videos, and it costs you nothing but a tap. And if you're still awake enough to type, drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. There's something nice about knowing that people are drifting off to the same story in a dozen different time zones tonight, all at once, all somewhere else in the dark. Now get comfortable, let your eyes close if they haven't already. And let's go back to a farm in Bethel, New York, where nobody, not the promoters, not the police, not the 400,000 people who showed up, had any real idea what they were about to walk into. Picture yourself in the passenger seat of a second-hand car on the morning of Friday, August 15th, 1969, somewhere on a two-lane road in Sullivan County, New York. You left before dawn. You've been moving for hours, and for the last stretch of that time, you haven't moved much at all. By midday, the roads leading into the tiny hamlet of Bethel had become something closer to a linear parking lot than a highway. Cars stretched back for close to 20 miles in some directions, bumper to bumper, engines overheating, radios playing to nobody in particular. What should have been a 2 or 3 hour drive from New York City stretched into 8 hours for some travelers and considerably longer for others. Eventually, people simply gave up. They pulled their cars onto the shoulder, onto front lawns, into ditches, and started walking the rest of the way on foot, carrying sleeping bags and coolers and guitars for miles down roads that had never been built to handle anything close to this many people. There's a moment from the festival that's become so famous, it's practically shorthand for the whole event. The musician, Arlo Guthrie, taking the stage and announcing to the crowd that the New York State Thruway was closed. It made it into the concert film. It's been repeated in documentaries and textbooks for decades, and it simply wasn't quite true. Police had closed a small number of exits near the festival grounds to try to stem the flow of traffic pouring toward Bethel, but the Thruway itself, a major artery running 50 miles away, never actually shut down. The rumor took on a life of its own anyway, because it captured something true, even if the specific detail was wrong. An ordinary Friday commute had been swallowed whole by a crowd nobody had planned for. And the crowd really was the whole story. The organizers, working off ticket pre-sales and their own optimistic guesswork, had told local officials to expect around 50,000 people over the course of the weekend. 50,000 was already a serious undertaking for a rural farm town with a couple of local roads and no experience hosting anything of the kind. What actually arrived by most estimates was somewhere between 4 and 5 times that number. Records from the period disagree on the exact figure, with estimates ranging from around 300,000 to as many as 700,000, depending on who was counting and how. Nobody could say for certain, because by the time the weekend was underway, nobody was checking tickets anymore. There simply weren't enough people at the gates to check them. Local radio and television stations, watching the chaos unfold in real time, began broadcasting warnings, telling listeners to stay away entirely. The roads were impassable, there was no more parking, don't attempt the drive. Some historians estimate that as many as 1 million more people heard those warnings and turned back or never left home at all, which means the swollen, overwhelming crowd that did arrive in Bethel was by some measure still only a fraction of the number of people who wanted to be there. For the people who did make it, the ones stepping out of abandoned cars and walking the last several miles with everything they'd brought on their backs, the traffic jam wasn't really an obstacle anymore by the time they reached it on foot. It had become part of the event itself. Strangers passed water and food between cars that hadn't moved in hours. People struck up conversations they might never have had under ordinary circumstances, stuck together in a slow motion migration toward a farm field none of them had ever seen. A National Guard official assigned to help manage the chaos noted, with a certain weary disbelief, that emergency vehicles couldn't reliably get in or out of the area at all. There was no path through the gridlock for an ambulance, let alone a tow truck. By Friday afternoon, the town of Bethel, a community with a year-round population that could be counted in the low thousands, had for all practical purposes become one of the more populous places in the entire state of New York, if only for a weekend. It hadn't asked for that distinction. It had simply been picked 6 weeks earlier as a replacement site after the original venue fell through, and it had no real infrastructure to absorb what was about to happen to it. So if you're picturing the arrival at Woodstock as some serene procession of flower children strolling peacefully into a meadow, adjust that image. Picture instead a genuine, sprawling, 20-mile logistical catastrophe, engines overheating in the August sun, families walking past strangers' abandoned cars, official warnings blaring from car radios telling everyone to turn back, and a slow, stubborn tide of people who kept walking anyway, because somewhere up ahead, past all of that gridlock, there was a stage and a farm and 3 days that none of them were going to miss. Here's a detail that tends to surprise people. Woodstock, the defining music festival of a generation, didn't start out as a festival idea at all. It started as a plan to build a recording studio. The plan came from 4 young men, none of them older than 27, who between them had almost no experience running an event of any real size. 2 of them, John Roberts and Joel Rosenman, were Ivy League graduates looking for business opportunities to invest in. Roberts, notably, was heir to a pharmaceutical fortune, which meant he had access to real money at a moment when the other 3 had mostly enthusiasm. The other 2, Michael Lang and Artie Kornfeld, were the ones with actual ties to the music industry. Lang had experience organizing a large concert in Miami the year before, and Kornfeld worked at a major record label. Together, the 4 of them settled on an idea. build a recording studio in the small, artsy town of Woodstock, New York, a place already known as a magnet for musicians looking to get away from the city. To help fund and promote the studio, they figured, why not throw a concert first? That concert idea grew and grew and grew again until what had started as a fundraising event for a recording studio had become something far bigger than any of the four men had originally intended, a multi day outdoor music festival designed to draw major acts, and they hoped a meaningful profit. The studio idea quietly fell away. The festival became the entire project. Finding a location proved to be the first real crisis, and it happened with startling speed. The original plan was to hold the event at an industrial park in the town of Wallkill, New York. Roughly 30 miles from the town, the festival would eventually be named after. Local opposition in Wallkill mounted fast. Officials worried about drugs, about crowd size, about disruption to the community, and only about a month before the festival was scheduled to happen, the town formally banned it from taking place there at all. With no venue, a fully booked lineup of major performers, and a date that was rapidly approaching, the organizers were, in the most literal sense, running out of options and running out of time. It was at this point that a local real estate agent in the Bethel area got word of their predicament and offered a suggestion. A dairy farmer nearby had land that might work. That farmer was Max Yasgur, and the 600 acres he agreed to rent out would go on to become one of the most famous plots of farmland in American cultural history. Yasgur was, by most accounts, an unlikely figure to end up at the center of a countercultural landmark, a working farmer in his 40s, already dealing with a history of heart trouble, who had studied real estate law before returning to run his family's dairy operation. He wasn't part of the youth counterculture the festival was built around. He was simply willing to rent his land for a fee, reportedly somewhere between $50,000 and $75,000, at a moment when almost no one else in the region would. The catch was time. The venue change happened only weeks before the festival's scheduled dates, which meant the crews building the stage, the sound systems, the fencing, and the basic infrastructure of the entire event were working against a clock that had already been cut brutally short even before the emergency relocation. Some of what would go wrong over the following days, the incomplete fencing, the inadequate ticket collection setup, the sanitation shortfalls, traces directly back to this compressed timeline. There simply wasn't enough time left to build the festival the organizers had originally designed on paper. Not everyone in the area welcomed the news, even after Yasgur agreed to the deal. Signs went up around the local community, urging neighbors to boycott Yasgur's dairy products in protest. Some residents reportedly threatened him with property damage or worse. Yasgur's wife would later recall that seeing one particular sign, needling him by name over his willingness to host what locals were calling a hippie music festival, only hardened her husband's resolve to go through with it rather than back down. So the festival that would eventually be remembered as an almost mythical, spontaneously peaceful gathering actually began its life as a fairly ordinary business venture. Four young men looking to make money off a recording studio, a relocated venue secured only weeks before opening day, and a dairy farmer who agreed to rent out his fields mostly because the price was right and because, by his own account, He didn't see why a group of young people gathering peacefully to hear music should be treated as a threat. None of the four organizers, and certainly not Yazgur himself, had any real sense of what they were about to unleash: a scale of crowd, chaos, and cultural consequence that would follow all of them for the rest of their lives. If you'd bought your tickets in advance, the way the organizers had hoped most attendees would, a 3-day pass to Woodstock would have cost you $18, a little over $100 in today's money, and a genuine bargain even by the standards of the time. Single day tickets ran around $6 or $7. At the gate, prices were expected to run higher still. It was, on paper, a perfectly conventional ticketing plan for a perfectly conventional, if ambitious, concert. What actually happened at the gates bore almost no resemblance to that plan. The compressed construction schedule we just talked about meant that a great many things got triaged, prioritized, and, in some cases, simply abandoned in the final rush before opening day. Chief among the casualties was the festival's ticket collection infrastructure. Turnstiles, ticket booths, and a securely fenced perimeter all require time and labor to build properly. And by the time crews had finished the stage and the basic sound system, there wasn't much of either left. The fencing that did go up was incomplete, and in many places, flimsy enough that it offered more of a suggestion than an actual barrier. Then the crowds arrived, not the 50,000 the organizers had planned for, but several times that number, converging on a rural farm with a security plan built for a much smaller, much more contained event. Faced with an unstoppable tide of people and a fence line that was never going to hold, festival staff made the only realistic choice available to them. They opened the gates. Whatever ticket collection process had been planned simply evaporated, and Woodstock, whether its organizers intended it or not, became a free concert almost from the moment the first day began. There's a kind of poetic irony in how thoroughly this accidental decision came to define the festival's legacy. In the decades since, Woodstock has often been remembered and even marketed as a free, all are welcome gathering built on countercultural generosity, a weekend where money simply didn't matter. The truth is closer to the opposite. It was a for profit commercial venture that lost control of its own perimeter and turned free not by design, but by necessity, because there was no longer any physical way to enforce payment on a crowd that size. The famous openness of Woodstock, in other words, was less a statement of values and more a logistical surrender. For the young men who'd organized the event, hoping to turn a profit, this was the moment their financial nightmare truly began, though most of them wouldn't fully grasp the scale of it until the festival was already over. We'll spend real time with just how bad that financial reckoning got later tonight. In the moment, though, on that Friday afternoon in August, the decision to simply let the crowds through carried a different kind of weight entirely. It meant that a plumber's kid from Brooklyn, without $18 to spare, could stand in the same muddy field as someone who'd paid full price weeks in advance, and nobody at the gate was going to check which one you were. For the attendees themselves, the practical experience of getting in to Woodstock varied wildly depending on when you arrived and which direction you came from. Some people who'd bought advance tickets never had them checked at all, walking straight through gaps in fencing that had simply given way under crowd pressure. Others waited in genuine lines for tickets that by the time they reached the front, no one was bothering to collect. A number of attendees later admitted, with a certain sheepish honesty, that they'd never actually purchased a ticket in the first place, banking on exactly the kind of chaos that ended up unfolding. It's difficult to overstate how thoroughly improvised this part of the weekend became. A festival that had budgeted and planned around an orderly commercial transaction, undone within hours by sheer numbers, and rebuilt on the fly into something closer to an open air gathering that simply happened to have a stage at one end of it. None of this means the finances stopped mattering. Somebody still had to pay Max Yasgur for his farmland, pay every performer their contracted fee, pay for the food, the medical staff, the helicopters that would soon be ferrying people and supplies in and out of a site the roads could no longer reach. All of that spending had been planned around ticket revenue that in the end mostly never arrived. The gates were open, the crowd was in, and somewhere behind the stage, the four young men who'd started this whole project as a plan to fund a recording studio were beginning to understand just how expensive an accidentally free festival was going to be. The postcard image of Woodstock tends to leave out the weather, or at most reduces it to a single word: muddy, treated almost as an aesthetic footnote rather than the genuine ongoing crisis it actually was for 3 straight days. It rained, not constantly, but repeatedly, in bursts heavy enough to turn the natural bowl shaped field in front of the stage into something closer to a shallow lake by the second day. Combine several 100,000 pairs of feet with soil that had already been softened by rain, and you get a specific, unforgettable texture that multiple attendees would describe for decades afterward. A thick, dark, sucking mud mixed liberally with the manure of what had, until recently, been an active dairy farm. People lost shoes to it. People lost their footing in it, sliding down slopes that had been perfectly walkable a day earlier. One attendee's description of it, given decades later, called it a quagmire so thick it looked like chocolate syrup, and so persistent that many people simply stopped trying to walk normally through it and instead started sliding down the hillside on purpose, turning the hazard into something closer to a game. That same mud created a genuine, serious danger that rarely makes it into the nostalgic retelling: electrocution risk. The stage that hundreds of thousands of people were facing was by necessity wired with a significant amount of electrical equipment: amplifiers, microphones, lighting rigs, none of it designed with a flooding, mud soaked field in mind. As rain continued through the second and third days, water pooled directly around stage equipment, and at several points, performers received real electrical shocks simply from touching their own microphones or instruments. One musician from a band performing that weekend later recalled being knocked back several feet after brushing against a microphone stand that had become live from the standing water beneath it. Behind the scenes, the show's sound engineers were genuinely worried, not about a poor performance, but about the real possibility that someone on that stage could be seriously hurt or killed by their own equipment before the weekend was over. Rain delays became their own recurring rhythm across the 3 days, repeatedly halting performances, pushing already slipping schedules further behind, and forcing performers and crew alike into a kind of improvisational patience that nobody had planned for. A set expected to run in the early evening might not actually begin until well past midnight. By the festival's final stretch, the schedule had drifted so far from its original plan that performances were happening in the middle of the night and continuing into the following morning, a chain reaction that traces directly back to those repeated weather delays stacking on top of each other, hour after hour, day after day. For the crowd itself, sitting or standing through these delays meant sitting through them in the open with minimal shelter, soaked through, waiting for music that might not resume for hours. And yet, across the accounts left behind by people who were actually there, the rain doesn't seem to have soured the mood nearly as much as you might expect. If anything, several attendees described the mud and the storms becoming a kind of shared ordeal that pulled strangers closer together rather than driving them apart. People passing plastic sheeting hand to hand for makeshift cover, strangers helping each other keep footing on slick hillsides, entire sections of the crowd breaking into spontaneous, defiant cheering each time a downpour let up enough for the music to resume. There's a specific kind of physical memory that seems to run through nearly every first hand account of Woodstock's weather, regardless of who's telling it. The mud got into everything: sleeping bags, clothing, food, hair. Nothing stayed clean for more than a few hours at a time. And by the festival's end, a huge share of the crowd had simply given up on shoes altogether, walking barefoot through fields littered with broken glass, discarded cans, and whatever other debris had been trampled into the muck by 500,000 pairs of feet. That single decision, bare feet over ruined, mud caked shoes, would go on to become the single most common medical complaint of the entire weekend. But we'll get to the makeshift hospital tents handling that particular crisis a little later tonight. For now, well, picture the field itself. Not a tidy, sun dappled meadow full of gently swaying flower children, but a genuinely waterlogged disaster zone, crossed by exposed electrical cable, lit by stage lights flickering through sheets of rain, and packed with hundreds of thousands of people who had somehow mostly decided that none of it was reason enough to leave. Every retelling of Woodstock eventually arrives at its opening moment, and almost every one of them gets the reason for it slightly wrong. The festival wasn't supposed to open with the performer it opened with. The scheduled first act, a band called Sweetwater, was still stuck somewhere in the traffic gridlock we spent time with earlier tonight, along with several other acts booked for the early part of the day. As the afternoon dragged on and the crowd kept growing, restless and packed shoulder to shoulder in front of an empty stage, festival organizers needed somebody, anybody, ready to perform immediately, not in an hour, not once the traffic cleared, but right now. That somebody turned out to be a folk singer and guitarist named Richie Havens, who happened to already be at the site, largely because his equipment, unlike several other performers, had actually made it through the traffic in time. He hadn't been slated to open. He didn't have an extended set prepared for the role he was about to be handed. And yet, when festival staff asked him to go on, he agreed, walked out in front of a crowd that had been waiting for hours, and simply started playing. What followed became one of the most legendary sets in the festival's history, born almost entirely out of necessity rather than planning. With no other acts ready to relieve him, and the crowd still swelling by the minute, Havens kept playing far longer than any single performer was ever expected to. by some accounts, close to 3 hours, cycling through nearly every song he knew, including a run of Beatles covers once his own material ran out. By the time he'd genuinely exhausted his repertoire and organizers still weren't ready for the next act, he did the only thing left to do. He made something up on the spot, improvising a song built around a single repeated word that would go on to become one of the defining anthems of the entire weekend, released commercially not long after, under the title Freedom. It hadn't existed in any written form 20 minutes before he first sang it. It was born entirely out of a performer buying time for a festival that wasn't ready for its own opening day. This kind of improvisation, scrambling, adapting, filling gaps that shouldn't have existed, became the defining rhythm of the entire weekend's schedule, not just its opening hour. The original festival lineup had been organized with a specific, tightly ordered sequence of performers, timed to specific slots across 3 days. Almost none of it survived contact with reality. Acts scheduled for the afternoon ended up performing after midnight. Some performers arrived so late, delayed by the same traffic gridlock that had stranded Sweetwater, that their sets were pushed back by the better part of a full day. Organizers found themselves constantly renegotiating the order of performances on the fly, based not on the printed schedule, but on the simple practical question of who had actually managed to reach the stage and who hadn't. Getting performers to the site at all became its own logistical operation, almost entirely separate from the ticket holding audience's ordeal on the roads below. With the surrounding highways rendered essentially impassable, organizers turned to helicopters, ferrying musicians, their equipment, and eventually emergency medical supplies directly onto the festival grounds, skipping the gridlock below entirely. It's a strange, almost cinematic image worth sitting with. While hundreds of thousands of ordinary attendees trudged the last several miles on foot, some of the most famous musicians in the country were being flown in low over their heads, dropped directly behind a stage that a full weekend earlier had still been an open field. By the time the festival's second and third days arrived, the printed schedule had become almost entirely symbolic, a rough suggestion of intended order rather than an actual timetable anyone could rely on. Performers waited for hours in muddy backstage areas, watching rain delays eat into whatever time slot they'd originally been promised. Audience members had no reliable way of knowing which act was coming next, or when, and simply stayed put, trusting that eventually whoever was scheduled would appear. What's easy to miss, looking back from a comfortable distance, is how much of what became iconic about that opening day, the star turn of a performer who wasn't even supposed to be first, an anthem written on the spot out of pure improvisational necessity, grew directly out of the same disorganization and crisis management that plagued nearly every other part of the weekend. Woodstock's most celebrated musical moments weren't the product of careful planning. They were what happened when careful planning collapsed, and the people left standing on that stage simply kept playing anyway. Take a moment here if you're still with us. So much of what we've covered so far has been about the gap between the version of an event that gets remembered and the version that actually happened. A festival famous for its openness that was really a fence that gave way, an iconic opening set born out of a scheduling disaster rather than a plan. It makes you wonder how many of our own favorite memories have quietly rearranged themselves the same way, smoothing out the chaos in hindsight until only the good part is left. If you're still listening and you feel like it, let us know in the comments about a memory of your own that you're pretty sure has gotten a little rosier with time. Then let your eyes close again and let's keep going, because behind that stage, 500,000 people still needed to be fed, and almost nobody had planned for that either. The popular image of a Woodstock attendee tends to be remarkably specific. A young, long haired hippie, likely from New York City or one of the coastal counterculture hubs, deeply committed to the political and social movements of the era, at the festival as much for the statement of being there as for the music itself. Like so much of what we've covered tonight, that image captures a real slice of the crowd while badly oversimplifying just how varied the actual 400,000 people in that field turned out to be. Geographically, the crowd was far more dispersed than the New York centric image suggests. While a large share of attendees did come from the surrounding region, New York City, New Jersey, and nearby states, given the practical reality of how far someone could reasonably travel for a weekend event. Significant numbers also came from much further afield, driving or hitchhiking across multiple states, sometimes for days, specifically to be there. The festival drew from a genuinely national pool of young people, not simply a regional one, reflecting just how far word of the event had spread through informal networks, radio coverage, and word of mouth in the weeks leading up to it. Age and life circumstance varied considerably too. While the popular image skews toward college age attendees in their late teens and early 20s, first-hand accounts and later interviews describe a noticeably wider range in practice. Younger teenagers who'd talked their way into the trip against their parents' wishes, alongside people in their late 20s and even older, including a meaningful number of attendees who were already working full-time jobs, married or raising young children, and simply took a long weekend to be part of something they suspected, correctly, might turn out to matter. Economic background varied as well, cutting against the assumption that the crowd was made up entirely of comfortable, disaffected young people from wealthy suburbs. Attendees came from working class backgrounds in real numbers, some scraping together gas money and food for the trip with real difficulty, treating the weekend as a genuine financial stretch rather than a casual lark. The eventual collapse of the ticket collection system, which we spent time with earlier tonight, meant that the financial barrier to attending dropped essentially to zero once the fences came down, opening the festival to people who might never have been able to afford the advance ticket price in the first place. Not every attendee, either, fit neatly into the specific political and cultural identity that hippie has come to represent in popular memory. Plenty of people at Woodstock were there almost entirely for the music, with only a loose, casual connection to the broader counterculture movements the festival has since become closely associated with. Others were deeply, actively engaged in the political and social causes of the era, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, various strands of the period's broader push for social change, and saw the festival as a genuine extension of that activism rather than a separate, purely musical event. The crowd, in other words, contained multitudes holding a far wider range of motivations, backgrounds, and beliefs than the single unified image of the Woodstock generation that emerged in the festival's aftermath ever really allowed for. There's a particular irony worth sitting with in how thoroughly that single unified image eventually won out over the messier, more varied reality. In the decades since 1969, Woodstock has become cultural shorthand for an entire generation's supposed values and identity. A single tidy symbol standing in for millions of individual young people who, in reality, disagreed with each other about almost everything beyond a shared appreciation for the music on that stage, and for many of them, a shared dread of the war waiting for them once the weekend ended. The crowd that actually stood in that muddy field was far too large, far too geographically and economically diverse, and far too politically varied to ever really fit inside the single, simplified image that history eventually settled on. But that simplified image was easier to sell, easier to film, and easier to remember. And so, more often than not, it's the one that survived. Somewhere on the festival grounds, sometime during the second day, the concession stands ran completely dry. This wasn't a small inconvenience. Feeding a planned crowd of 50,000 people for a weekend is a serious undertaking on its own. Feeding several times that number, most of whom hadn't been accounted for in any supply order, was never actually possible with what the festival had on hand. The food concessions that had been arranged in advance were overwhelmed almost immediately, exhausted well before the weekend even reached its midpoint, leaving hundreds of thousands of people with no reliable organized source of meals for the remainder of the festival. What filled that gap wasn't the festival's official planning. It was, in large part, a loosely organized commune from New Mexico called the Hog Farm, originally brought in by organizers for a much narrower purpose, helping manage security and crowd behavior in a gentle, non confrontational way, rather than relying on traditional police presence. Once it became clear that food, not security, was the weekend's most urgent crisis, the group pivoted almost entirely, recruiting new volunteers on the spot from within the crowd itself and turning whatever supplies they could gather into enormous improvised meals, vats of grain, vegetables, and whatever else could be sourced quickly enough to matter, served to anyone who came looking for something to eat. It still wasn't close to enough. Word of the shortage reached beyond the festival grounds fairly quickly, and the response that followed came from several directions at once. A local Jewish community center, hearing reports of the crisis, mobilized volunteers to prepare thousands of sandwiches, which were then flown by helicopter directly onto the festival site from a nearby military installation. Another example of the same emergency air bridge that was already being used to ferry in stranded performers and medical supplies. The New York State government authorized additional support, and National Guard helicopters became a regular, almost constant presence overhead throughout the weekend, dropping food, water, and blankets into a crowd that had, in the space of about 24 hours, become one of the largest gatherings of people in the entire history of the state, with none of the infrastructure that population size would normally require. On the ground, ordinary attendees became an essential, unplanned part of the same emergency response. First-hand accounts from the festival describe strangers sharing food freely with people who had none, passing loaves of bread and containers of water down through packed crowds, splitting whatever supplies they'd personally brought with anyone nearby who was running low. It's one of the details from that weekend that shows up again and again across independent accounts, largely unprompted by any single retelling. In the middle of an actual, serious supply crisis, the prevailing instinct among the crowd itself seems to have been generosity rather than competition or hoarding. Local towns surrounding the festival site felt the ripple effects of the shortage almost immediately. Grocery stores and restaurants in Bethel and neighboring communities were stripped nearly bare within the first day or two, as festival goers who could reach a working vehicle or a walkable town center bought up whatever remained on the shelves. For a rural area that hadn't remotely anticipated hosting an event of this scale, the sudden overwhelming demand placed real strain on ordinary local commerce, adding to a broader tension between the festival crowd and its host community that we'll spend more time with later tonight. There's a particular kind of improvisation that runs through nearly every account of how the food crisis actually got managed, and it's worth naming clearly because it says something real about how the entire weekend held together despite itself. Nobody in a position of formal authority, not the festival's four young organizers, not local government, not even the National Guard, had a coordinated plan in place to feed this many people. What actually happened instead was a patchwork response, assembled in real time out of a commune's volunteers, a community center's donated sandwiches, military helicopters repurposed for civilian food delivery, and hundreds of thousands of individual small decisions by attendees to share rather than hoard. It worked, in the sense that mass starvation never occurred, and reports of serious hunger related medical emergencies stayed relatively limited. But it worked the way so much of that weekend worked, not because anyone had planned for it, but because enough people, faced with a genuine crisis, simply decided to take care of each other instead of panicking. Behind the main stage, in a set of tents that had been thrown together with far less planning than the festival's organizers would have liked, a small team of doctors and nurses spent 3 days managing what quietly became one of the largest improvised field medicine operations in American history up to that point. The doctor formally in charge of the effort, a physician named William Abruzzi, who'd later be nicknamed the Rock Doc in press coverage of the event, had originally been brought on for a role that looked nothing like what he actually ended up doing. He quickly realized that the medical need at a gathering this size would badly outstrip anything close to what had been planned for, and began pulling in additional doctors and nurses from surrounding towns, while local hospitals throughout the region were placed on alert for overflow patients they'd have no realistic way to reach by road. By the time the festival's medical operation tallied its final numbers, the scale of what they'd handled was staggering for an event of this kind. Over 5,000 people treated across the 3.5 days, according to the New York State Department of Health's official report on the festival. The single most common injury by a wide margin wasn't drug related at all. It was simple foot lacerations, the direct result of hundreds of thousands of people walking barefoot through mud littered with broken glass and debris, a consequence of the muddy conditions we spent time with earlier tonight. Over 800 foot injuries alone were logged and treated across the weekend. Drug related incidents made up a real, significant share of the medical caseload, too. Several hundred cases by the festival's official tally, though the great majority were managed with rest, reassurance, and calm supervision, rather than requiring serious medical intervention. This is where the hog farm's role, which we touched on a moment ago in the context of food, mattered again in a completely different way. Beyond cooking and crowd management, the group had experience helping people through difficult, frightening drug reactions using a calm, non clinical, talk someone down approach, sitting with someone, staying close, helping them ride out a bad experience without panic. And that approach became a genuine, working part of the festival's broader medical response, handling a volume of cases that a small formal medical staff alone could never have managed. One moment from the weekend has become particularly famous, repeated in nearly every retelling of the festival's drug culture. An announcement from the stage warning the crowd that a specific batch of a particular drug circulating through the grounds wasn't safe, poorly made rather than deliberately poisoned, but risky enough that people were being cautioned against it directly from the main stage to a crowd of several 100,000 people. It's a strange, almost surreal detail to picture. A festival still being run, at least nominally, by four fairly inexperienced young promoters, taking on an ad hoc public health messaging role that no government agency at the event was prepared to handle. It's worth being honest about what all of this adds up to without either exaggerating it into something more dangerous than it was or minimizing it into a punchline. Drug use at Woodstock was widespread and visible in a way that reflected the broader counterculture the festival had grown out of. This was, after all, a gathering explicitly associated with a generation pushing back against a lot of the era's conventional norms. But the medical record left behind by the festival's own doctors tells a more measured story than the reputation the weekend has carried ever since. The overwhelming majority of the roughly 5,000 people treated over those 3 days were dealing with cut feet, dehydration, exhaustion, and minor injuries, the ordinary physical toll of camping outdoors in the rain and mud for days at a stretch, packed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of thousands of strangers, not primarily a catastrophe of drug use spiraling out of control. What the medical tents really represent in the end is one more example of the same pattern running through so much of this weekend. A genuine, serious need that the festival's official planning had almost entirely failed to anticipate, met in practice by a scrambled coalition of borrowed doctors, volunteer counterculture communes, and local hospitals bracing for patients they couldn't easily reach. It worked, more or less. Nobody involved would call it well organized. But by the time the last patient was treated on Monday morning, the improvised medical operation behind Woodstock's stage had quietly handled a level of chaos that a great many properly funded, professionally staffed events of the era never came close to facing. Somewhere underneath everything else that made Woodstock possible, the traffic, the tickets, the improvised medical tents, sat a genuinely remarkable feat of engineering that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the festival's more famous chaos, the sound system itself. In 1969, nothing resembling a professional, purpose built system capable of delivering clear, powerful audio to a crowd of several 100,000 people actually existed. Concert audio technology at the time was designed around venues that held a few thousand people at most: arenas, theaters, the occasional outdoor stadium. Nobody had ever needed to solve the specific problem Woodstock's organizers were about to hand to their sound engineer. How do you make a single guitar, a single voice, audible and clear across a natural amphitheater packed with a crowd larger than most American cities? The man tasked with solving that problem was an audio engineer named Bill Hanley, who'd built a reputation working sound for large outdoor events earlier in the decade, though nothing on the scale Woodstock was about to demand of him. Working with a compressed timeline and a budget that, like nearly everything else at the festival, hadn't been designed around the true size of the eventual crowd, Hanley and his team assembled a sound system built substantially from custom modified speaker components, some of it adapted from equipment originally intended for entirely different purposes, arranged in configurations that hadn't been extensively tested at this kind of scale before. The engineering challenge went well beyond simple volume. Sound traveling across an open field behaves very differently than sound bouncing around an enclosed venue and a natural bowl shaped landscape like the one at Yazgur's farm. While excellent for giving hundreds of thousands of people a clear sightline to the stage, created its own acoustic complications, with sound reflecting unpredictably off distant hillsides and losing clarity and power the farther it traveled from the source. Hanley's system had to account for all of this, essentially from scratch, without the benefit of the kind of acoustic modeling and testing tools that would become standard for large event production in later decades. Then came the weather. The same rain that turned the field to mud and forced electrical shock concerns for performers created an entirely separate crisis for the sound equipment itself, which had to be protected, monitored, and in some cases repaired on the fly across 3 days of intermittent, sometimes heavy, downpours, all while remaining live and functional for a schedule that had already collapsed into near constant improvisation. Keeping hundreds of thousands of watts of audio equipment operational through repeated soakings in an era before the kind of weatherproofing standard equipment carries today required constant, largely improvised troubleshooting from Hanley's crew throughout the entire weekend. By most later assessments from audio engineers and historians of live music production, the system Hanley and his team built for Woodstock is now regarded as a genuine milestone in the development of large scale concert sound, one of the first systems capable of delivering genuinely clear, powerful audio to a crowd measured in the hundreds of thousands, built under conditions that gave the team almost no room for error and even less time to prepare. Elements of the techniques and equipment configurations pioneered for that weekend went on to directly influence how large outdoor concerts and festivals were engineered for decades afterward, making Woodstock, alongside everything else it's remembered for, a genuine turning point in the technical history of live music. It's a detail worth holding on to specifically because it runs against the grain of nearly everything else covered tonight. So much of what happened at Woodstock succeeded, if it succeeded at all, through pure improvisation and last minute scrambling. The food, the medical response, the security. The sound system stands out as one of the rare pieces of the festival's infrastructure that worked as well as it did not primarily because of improvisation, but because of genuine, forward thinking technical expertise brought to bear on a problem that had never really been solved before by a small crew of engineers whose names most attendees dancing in the mud that weekend never thought to ask. Of all the infrastructure failures that defined Woodstock, the one that made the least romantic footage and gets left out of nearly every nostalgic retelling was also one of the most immediate and constant for the people actually living through it. There was almost nowhere to go to the bathroom. The festival had arranged for around 600 portable toilets, a number that would have been reasonably adequate, tight but workable for the 50,000 attendees organizers had originally planned around. Against a crowd that ultimately swelled past 400,000 people, that same 600 units amounted to something in the neighborhood of one toilet for every 700 or 800 attendees, a ratio that made regular, comfortable access to a working bathroom essentially impossible for most of the weekend. For comparison, a properly outfitted stadium of the era might offer something closer to one toilet for every 60 or 70 attendees. Woodstock was operating at a small fraction of that standard and falling further behind with every hour the crowd kept growing. The toilets that did exist filled up fast, and once full, largely stayed that way since there was no realistic way to service and empty them at the rate the crowd required. Lines stretched for lengths that could take the better part of an hour to work through, assuming the facility at the front of the line was even still usable by the time you reached it. A significant number of attendees, faced with those odds, simply gave up on the formal facilities entirely and improvised, retreating into the surrounding woods or fields, a practical, if unglamorous, solution that further strained the already overtaxed farmland the festival was being held on. Combine that with the rain and mud we spent real time with earlier tonight, and you get a set of sanitary conditions that several attendees, along with at least one reporter covering the event for a local paper, described using a specific, unflinching word: conditions closer to a crowded refugee encampment than a concert venue, with waste, mud, and standing water intermixing across large sections of the grounds by the festival's second and third days. Health officials, monitoring the event from a distance, grew increasingly concerned about the realistic possibility of a genuine outbreak. Dysentery, other waterborne illness, the kind of thing that spreads fast through exactly these conditions, though remarkably, no major epidemic actually materialized over the course of the weekend, a small mercy given just how far the sanitation infrastructure had fallen behind the size of the crowd. Water itself became a related, complicated issue. The festival grounds did have some access to clean water, but not nearly enough to reliably serve a crowd of this size for drinking, washing, and basic hygiene all at once. In a detail that captures something real about the tension simmering just beneath the festival's peaceful reputation, a handful of local residents outside the immediate festival grounds reportedly began selling water to increasingly desperate, dehydrated attendees during the weekend, a decision that, when it reached Max Yazgor's attention, apparently offended him enough that he pushed back directly against turning something as basic as drinking water into a profit opportunity off the backs of exhausted, overheated young people who'd already been stranded for hours in traffic and mud. For the attendees themselves, living through 3 days without reliable sanitation became simply one more shared hardship folded into the broader ordeal of the weekend, uncomfortable, unglamorous, and almost entirely absent from the polished documentary footage and soundtrack album that would later shape how the wider world remembered Woodstock. The cameras were pointed at the stage, at the crowd swaying to the music, at the rain soaked dancing that made for genuinely striking footage. They weren't pointed, understandably, at the hour-long lines forming outside 600 overwhelmed portable toilets, or at the fields where hundreds of thousands of people were, out of pure necessity, improvising their own solutions to a problem the festival's planning had almost completely failed to anticipate. It's a small, unglamorous detail in the grand mythology of Woodstock, and maybe that's exactly why it's worth remembering. The festival's most iconic image is one of joyful, muddy freedom. The reality at ground level included a genuinely difficult, physically uncomfortable sanitation crisis that several 100,000 people simply had to push through, one overflowing toilet line and one improvised solution at a time, because turning around and going home was by that point its own multi hour ordeal through the same gridlocked roads that had gotten them there in the first place. Picture the festival grounds after dark, once the day's heat had finally broken and the crowd had settled, however loosely, into whatever patch of hillside they'd claimed as their own for the weekend. Daytime at Woodstock ran hot and close, hundreds of thousands of bodies packed together under an August sun with almost no shade across the open bowl of the field, the air thick with dust before the rains came, and thick with humidity after. Night brought a different set of sensations entirely. Temperatures dropped fast once the sun went down, cool enough that many attendees, having packed for a warm summer weekend rather than genuinely cold nights, found themselves underprepared, huddling under whatever blankets, jackets, or spare clothing they had, or pressed close against strangers simply for the shared warmth of it. Small fires dotted the hillsides once darkness fell, built from whatever scrap wood and cardboard people could gather, their light scattered across acres of muddy ground like a second dimmer constellation laid over the crowd itself. Around these fires, people who'd arrived as total strangers spent hours talking, sharing food, passing around instruments, singing along to whoever happened to have brought a guitar. For a significant share of attendees, these smaller, informal gatherings away from the main stage became just as memorable in their own way as anything that happened in front of the performers, a kind of parallel festival made up of thousands of tiny, self organized communities scattered across the same dark field. The stage itself, lit against the night sky, became a kind of beacon visible from almost anywhere on the grounds, its lights refracting through the mist and occasional drizzle that hung over the property after each rain delay. Sound carried strangely across that landscape after dark, the way sound often does once the ambient noise of a crowd settles and the cool night air lets it travel further, a guitar solo or a familiar chorus, reaching all the way to the furthest, most distant hillsides, where people who couldn't see the stage at all still found themselves able to follow along with whatever was happening down below. Sleep, to the extent it happened at all, came in fragments, snatched between sets, between rain showers, between whatever conversation or music was happening nearby. Many attendees simply stayed awake through entire nights, moving between the stage and the smaller fireside gatherings, catching a performer they'd specifically come to see, and then wandering back out into the darkness to talk with strangers until the next act began. The rhythm of ordinary time, bedtime, wake time, the usual boundaries between one day and the next, dissolved almost entirely across the weekend, replaced by a looser, more fluid sense of duration governed less by the clock than by whatever was happening on stage or around whichever fire someone happened to be sitting near. For all the hardship layered into those nights, the cold, the persistent damp, the discomfort of trying to rest on wet ground with inadequate bedding, a striking number of first hand accounts describe the nighttime hours as some of the most vivid, most memorable parts of the entire weekend, treasured specifically because of how strange and communal they felt. There was a particular kind of intimacy in being one of several 100,000 strangers spread out across a dark hillside, all listening to the same faraway music drifting through the night air, all equally cold, equally muddy, equally far from home. It's a version of the festival that rarely makes it into the daytime photographs most people associate with Woodstock. The sun drenched crowd shots, the muddy dancing captured in bright daylight. But for many of the people who were actually there, it's the nights, not the days, that stayed with them longest. By the time the sky began to lighten again each morning, revealing the full scope of the mud, the litter, and the sheer scale of the crowd all over again in unforgiving daylight, something about the previous night's fires and quiet conversations tended to feel, if only briefly, like it belonged to a slightly different, gentler version of the same event. Proof that even in the middle of a genuine logistical catastrophe, several 100,000 tired, cold, muddy strangers had still found their way, night after night, into something that felt, however fleetingly, like community. After all of this, the traffic, the mud, the food shortage, the medical tents, the overwhelmed toilets, you might reasonably expect that a crowd of 400,000 exhausted, hungry, soaking wet young people would have eventually turned on each other. It's worth sitting with the fact that by nearly every account left behind, they didn't. This is one of the few pieces of Woodstock's legend that holds up remarkably well against the actual historical record, and it's worth taking seriously precisely because so much else about the festival's reputation turns out to be exaggerated or accidental. Given the genuinely difficult conditions on the ground, the rate of violence, theft, and serious conflict across the 3 day event was strikingly low. A journalist covering the festival for the local paper, who'd initially written skeptically about the crowds descending on the region, ended up publishing a follow up piece specifically noting the cooperation and generosity on display, and continued reporting favorably on the crowd's behavior even as the logistical situation around them kept deteriorating. Part of this seems to trace directly back to a deliberate choice made early in the planning process, one that ran against the conventional playbook for managing a crowd this size. The original plan to bring in a large contingent of off duty New York City police officers for security fell apart before the festival even began, when the officers involved were warned that their participation might violate department policy, and the arrangement was called off. Rather than scrambling for a replacement force built around conventional law enforcement, organizers land instead on the hog farm commune we've already spent time with tonight. The same group that pivoted to feeding the crowd and talking people through difficult drug reactions. Their approach to security wasn't confrontation, it was closer to gentle, deliberate de escalation, walking the grounds, diffusing tension through calm conversation rather than authority, treating the crowd as people to be looked after rather than a threat to be controlled. Whether that specific choice fully explains the weekend's relative peacefulness is genuinely hard to say with certainty. 100 other factors were surely in play, from the shared hardship of the mud and the food shortage pulling people together rather than apart, to the simple demographic reality of who this particular crowd mostly was. But it's a detail worth sitting with regardless, because it cuts directly against a common assumption that keeping several 100,000 people orderly requires visible, forceful authority. At Woodstock, for whatever combination of reasons, something closer to the opposite approach seems to have worked. The generosity that ran through the food crisis showed up again and again in smaller, less documented ways across the weekend. Strangers helped each other find lost friends in a crowd with no reliable way to communicate across long distances. People shared blankets, dry clothing, whatever shelter they'd managed to rig up against the rain, with others nearby who had none. Accounts from the period describe an atmosphere that, despite every logistical failure stacking on top of the last, somehow didn't curdle into resentment or panic, but instead seemed to reinforce a shared sense that everyone present was, in some loose but genuine way, looking out for each other. None of this should be romanticized into something it wasn't. This was still an enormous, physically exhausting, genuinely dangerous situation in several real respects, and we'll spend time shortly tonight with the darker parts of that reality, including the small number of people who didn't make it home. Peacefulness and hardship weren't opposites at Woodstock. They existed side by side, often in the very same hour, on the very same patch of muddy ground. But it's worth naming plainly, especially after everything else we've covered so far tonight. The parts of Woodstock's myth built around cooperation, generosity, and a crowd that somehow held itself together with almost no formal authority holding it up. Those parts largely check out. Woodstock wasn't a peaceful weekend because nothing went wrong. It was a peaceful weekend as much as it was one because when things did go wrong, again and again, in ways that would have justified real panic, the people actually there mostly chose to help each other through it instead. With everything we've spent tonight covering, the traffic, the mud, the food shortage, the medical tents, it would be easy to forget that Woodstock was, at its core, still a music festival, and that across 3 chaotic days, a genuinely remarkable run of performances happened on that stage, regardless of how far behind schedule they were running or how few people were dry enough to fully enjoy them. Janis Joplin took the stage late on the festival's second night, well after the delays and rain had pushed the schedule hours past where it was supposed to be. By most accounts from people who witnessed it, her performance that night captured something raw and unfiltered even by her own standards, a voice already legendary for its intensity, pushed further by a crowd that had been waiting, soaked, and exhausted for hours to hear her. It would turn out to be one of her last major performances before her death less than a year later, though nobody in that muddy field that night had any way of knowing it at the time. Santana's appearance that same day became, almost by accident, one of the most consequential bookings of the entire festival. Relatively unknown outside the West Coast at the time, the band delivered a ferocious, percussion driven set built around extended instrumental improvisation, most famously during a piece called Soul Sacrifice, that left much of the watching crowd and the cameras capturing it for what would become the festival's documentary film visibly stunned. The exposure that performance provided turned out to be transformative for the band's career, launching them from a regional act into a nationally recognized name almost overnight on the strength of a single set played to a rain soaked field of strangers. Sly and the Family Stone took the stage deep into the overnight hours between the second and third days and delivered a set built around tight, propulsive funk and soul that, by several accounts, helped re energize a crowd that had been sitting through hours of delays and increasingly exhausted waiting. Their performance is frequently cited by musicians and historians alike as one of the weekend's most electric, a jolt of pure rhythm delivered at close to 4 in the morning to a crowd that by any reasonable expectation should have been too tired to respond the way they did. The Who arrived even later that same overnight stretch, plagued by their own technical delays, and played a set that stretched into the earliest hours of Sunday morning, timed almost by accident to conclude just as the sun was rising over the festival grounds. Guitarist Pete Townshend's performance that morning became, in its own way, part of the festival's mythology for reasons that had nothing to do with music. Partway through the set, the countercultural figure Abby Hoffman climbed onto the stage attempting to make a political statement to the crowd, and Townshend, reportedly furious at the interruption, shoved him back off using the neck of his guitar. It's a small, sharp moment of real tension breaking through the festival's more peaceful reputation, a reminder that not every interaction that weekend was gentle or harmonious, even among the performers themselves. Joan Baez, several months pregnant at the time and performing without her husband, who was in prison at the time for resisting the military draft, closed out the first night with a set that leaned heavily on songs of protest and solidarity, delivered to a crowd that, whatever else divided them, largely shared her audience's broader unease about the war overseas. Her performance became one of several moments across the weekend where the festival's music and the political backdrop of the era intersected directly and openly, rather than staying at arm's length from each other. And Country Joe McDonald, performing solo earlier in the weekend after his full band had been delayed, led the crowd through a call and response chant that had already become something of an anthem within the counterculture, its lyrics built around bitter, sardonic commentary on the ongoing war, a moment that hundreds of thousands of voices joined in on together, a brief, unified outburst of the same anxiety and anger simmering underneath so much of that summer. Across all of it, the through line worth remembering is this. For every hour spent waiting in the mud, dealing with the toilets, or hunting down something to eat, there was also, somewhere on that stage, a performance happening that would go on to define careers, launch new audiences, and, in a handful of cases, become some of the most closely studied live recordings in the history of American popular music. The chaos and the artistry weren't separate stories that weekend. They were happening at exactly the same time, on exactly the same patch of muddy ground. One of the stranger footnotes to Woodstock's legacy is how many artists closely associated with the era, and in some cases with the festival's own mythology, were never actually there at all. Start with the most famous absence. Bob Dylan, arguably the single most influential songwriter of the decade, actually lived in the town of Woodstock itself at the time, and the festival's original organizers had specifically chosen the name partly to capitalize on that connection, hoping his presence in the area might translate into either an appearance or at least a symbolic association with the event. Neither happened. Dylan didn't perform, and by most accounts of people close to him at the time, his absence wasn't really about scheduling conflicts, whatever official explanation circulated. He'd reportedly grown uncomfortable with the crowds of fans and hangers on already gathering around his home in the town of Woodstock, drawn there specifically because of his residence, and had little appetite for headlining an event that promised to bring an even larger, more chaotic version of exactly that kind of attention directly to his doorstep. He ended up leaving the country around the festival's dates entirely, performing instead at a much smaller event overseas. The Beatles never appeared either, and the reason, as it's generally been told, comes down to a single point of negotiation that organizers weren't willing to budge on. John Lennon reportedly wanted his partner, the artist Yoko Ono, to perform alongside him if the group took the stage, and when that condition wasn't accepted, the appearance simply never came together. It's a small, almost mundane footnote to what could have been one of the most consequential bookings in the festival's history, and a reminder of how much of Woodstock's final lineup was shaped by ordinary scheduling and negotiation friction rather than any grand cultural design. Led Zeppelin, already one of the biggest acts of the moment, turned down an invitation as well, reportedly out of concern that being just one act among dozens on a crowded festival bill would undercut the momentum they were building as a headlining act in their own right. Iron Butterfly, another band that had been booked to appear, ran into a more unusual obstacle. They'd specifically requested a helicopter to get them and their equipment to the increasingly inaccessible site, given the gridlock we spent real time with earlier tonight. And when that helicopter failed to materialize in time, they were left stranded, unable to reach the festival grounds at all, and were ultimately dropped from the lineup entirely. Perhaps the strangest absence of all belongs to an artist whose name is now permanently, almost inseparably, linked to the festival in popular memory: Joni Mitchell. The song most associated with Woodstock in the decades since later turned into hit recordings by other artists on the bill that weekend, was written by Mitchell herself, and yet she was never actually there. Her involvement with the festival came entirely secondhand through her partner at the time, a member of one of the bands that did perform, who described the atmosphere of the weekend to her afterward. She turned his account, filtered entirely through someone else's experience, into one of the era's most enduring songs about a festival she'd watched unfold only through second-hand descriptions. There's something worth sitting with in that particular detail because it captures a broader truth about how Woodstock's legend actually got built. So much of what the wider world came to understand about the festival arrived filtered through a hit song written by someone who wasn't there, through a documentary film assembled from selective footage after the fact, through secondhand retellings that smoothed over the mud, the shortages, and the chaos in favor of a cleaner, more mythic version of the weekend. The artists who weren't present at Woodstock ended up shaping its cultural memory nearly as much as many of the ones who were. And for the performers who did show up, plenty of smaller absences and near misses shaped the actual lineup in ways audiences at the time never fully appreciated. Acts scrambled to replace other acts who couldn't make it through the traffic. Set times shifted so dramatically that some performers ended up playing to a fraction of the crowd that had been present for the act before them, simply because so many hours had passed and the audience had shifted or thinned in the meantime. The lineup that history remembers as fixed and iconic was in the moment a constantly shifting, half improvised roster, shaped as much by who could physically reach the stage as by who'd originally been booked to stand on it. By the time the festival's final scheduled performer was actually ready to take the stage, it wasn't Sunday night anymore. It was Monday morning, well past sunrise, and the crowd that remained to see it had shrunk from several 100,000 people down to a fraction of that number, commonly estimated at somewhere around 30 to 40,000. A crowd still enormous by any ordinary standard, but a genuine collapse from the peak of the weekend. The performer waiting behind that stage was Jimi Hendrix, already established by 1969 as one of the most electrifying live guitarists in the world, and by a wide margin, the highest paid act booked for the entire festival. His contract reportedly included a specific clause guaranteeing that no other act would perform after him, which meant that as the schedule kept sliding later and later across 3 days of rain delays and technical problems, his closing slot kept sliding right along with it, eventually landing him a performance start time of around 9 o'clock on Monday morning, many hours after the festival had technically been scheduled to end, and long after a large share of its audience had already begun the slow, muddy trek back to their cars. What unfolded over the next 2 hours became, almost immediately, one of the most analyzed and replayed musical performances of the decade. Backed by a band assembled specifically for the occasion, Hendrix played an extended set that closed with an instrumental rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. No lyrics sung, just guitar, stretched, bent, and distorted across the melody in a way that struck many listeners at the time, and countless critics and historians since, as a direct musical commentary on the state of the country in 1969, a year defined by war overseas and deep division at home. Some in the small remaining crowd heard something close to defiance in it. Others heard mourning. Very few who were actually present that morning describe hearing it as a simple, straightforward rendition of a familiar tune. There's a particular irony worth sitting with here, one that gets lost in how the performance is usually remembered. Despite becoming arguably the single most iconic musical moment associated with Woodstock in the decades since, endlessly excerpted, endlessly referenced, endlessly treated as the symbolic capstone of the entire weekend, hardly anyone who'd actually attended the festival was there to witness it in person. The vast majority of the people who would come to know this performance experienced it entirely secondhand through the documentary film released the following year, through the soundtrack album, through photographs, and later retellings. The live audience for one of the most famous guitar performances in American musical history was, by the standards of the weekend that preceded it, almost nobody. Hendrix himself had reportedly spent much of the preceding days simply wandering the festival grounds rather than staying close to a set time that kept getting pushed later and later, watching other performers, absorbing an event that, like nearly everyone else present, he hadn't fully anticipated the scale of. By the time his own moment on stage finally arrived, the festival around him had already largely dispersed. Trash and abandoned belongings scattered across acres of trampled, rain soaked field, most of the crowd gone, cleanup crews, and a handful of dedicated volunteers beginning the slow work of putting the farm back together, even as the final notes were still ringing out from the stage. It's worth holding both halves of this moment in your mind at once. In the history of American music, few performances carry more symbolic weight than Hendrix's closing set at Woodstock. And in the actual, physical reality of that Monday morning, it happened in front of a tired, thinned out remnant of a crowd on a field that had already emptied of most of the people who'd make the festival famous in the first place. A genuinely intimate, half abandoned coda to an event that only 2 days earlier had been the site of one of the largest gatherings of people in American history. Underneath the music, the mud, and the improvised generosity of that weekend sat a much heavier, much more specific anxiety, one that touched an enormous share of the young men in that crowd, whether they talked about it openly or not. The ongoing war overseas, and the draft that meant a significant number of the people dancing in that field had a real, concrete chance of being sent there within the following year. By the summer of 1969, the war had already stretched on for years, with American casualties mounting steadily and no clear end in sight, and it had become, for a huge share of the generation gathering at Yazgur's farm, less an abstract political issue than an immediate personal one. Young men of a certain age lived with the draft as a constant looming possibility, their futures genuinely uncertain in a way that's difficult to fully convey from a distance. Some of the attendees at Woodstock had already served and come home. Some were actively resisting the draft through legal or illegal means, facing real legal consequences for doing so. Some were still waiting to find out which category they'd eventually fall into. We touched earlier tonight on one of the more direct intersections between the war and the festival's own history. The 18-year-old Marine, home on leave and awaiting deployment, who died during the weekend, a detail that quietly underscores just how present the war was, even at an event popularly remembered as a retreat from exactly that kind of reality. He wasn't the only attendee carrying that particular weight. Countless others in that crowd were facing their own deployment orders, their own draft board decisions, their own versions of the same uncertain, frightening timeline, even as they spent 3 days dancing barefoot in the mud to music built, in no small part, around exactly that anxiety. The music itself reflected this reality constantly, in ways that went well beyond any single performer's political leanings. Songs of protest, songs about loss, songs built around bitter, sardonic humor aimed squarely at the war and the institutions prosecuting it, ran through the festival's set lists all weekend, met with the kind of full crowd, full throated response that only happens when a lyric is landing on an audience that's living the thing being sung about, not just sympathizing with it from a distance. When hundreds of thousands of voices joined together in a chant mocking the war, it wasn't an abstract political statement for most of the people singing it. It was personal, immediate, and urgent in a way that's easy to lose sight of once a moment, like that gets flattened into festival trivia decades later. This broader anxiety helps explain something important about why Woodstock resonated as deeply as it did, both in the moment and in the decades of retelling that followed. The festival wasn't simply a concert that happened to draw a large crowd. It became, for many of the people who attended, a brief, temporary escape from a genuinely frightening set of circumstances hanging over their immediate futures. A chance to spend 3 days surrounded by people who understood exactly what that particular fear felt like without needing to explain it, in a setting that offered music, community, and a kind of collective permission to set that fear aside, if only for a weekend. It's worth resisting the urge to reduce this part of the story to any single political position or figure, because the anxiety itself cut across a far wider range of people and opinions than the festival's later reputation as a purely countercultural, protest driven gathering sometimes suggests. Not everyone in that crowd agreed on what should be done about the war. Some were there specifically to protest it. Others were there simply because they were about to be sent to fight in it and wanted one more weekend of ordinary life before that happened. What united nearly all of them, regardless of where they landed politically, was the shared, unavoidable knowledge that the war wasn't a distant news story for their generation. It was the single largest fact shaping their immediate futures, hanging over even the most joyful moments of that muddy, chaotic 3 day weekend. For all the mythology built around Woodstock as a weekend of pure, uncomplicated joy, it's worth sitting honestly and gently with the fact that not everyone who arrived at Max Yasgur's farm went home again. The most solidly documented loss of the weekend was a 17-year-old from New Jersey named Raymond Mizak, who had set up his sleeping bag in a field being used as an overflow parking and camping area. In the chaos and darkness of the crowded grounds, a tractor being used to help manage vehicles and debris moved through that field without its driver realizing someone was sleeping there, and Mizak was killed. The driver was never identified, and a grand jury later reviewing the incident found there wasn't enough evidence to bring charges against anyone. It's a quiet, devastating detail to hold on to amid everything else about that weekend. A young life lost not to any of the chaos everyone remembers, the traffic or the mud or the drugs, but to something as ordinary and preventable as a tired crowd, a dark field, and heavy machinery moving through it. A second death is far less consistently reported across the historical record, and it's worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than smoothing it over. An 18-year-old Marine, home on leave before an expected deployment to Vietnam, also died during the festival. Most contemporary coverage attributed his death to a drug overdose, and that's the version that's been repeated most often in the decades since. At least one more recent historical account, drawing on original medical records from the festival, has suggested a more complicated possibility that his death may actually have resulted from a severe reaction to medication administered to treat him, combined with heat exposure rather than the overdose itself. The full truth may never be fully settled. What's certain is that a young man who had already served his country and was due to return to a war zone shortly after didn't make it home from a weekend that was supposed to be, for him as for so many others, a brief window of peace before facing something much harder. Some accounts of the festival mention a third death as well, though the details around it are considerably murkier and less consistently documented than the two losses above, another reflection of just how difficult it was to keep any kind of reliable, centralized record across a gathering this chaotic and this large. Births present an almost mirror image version of the same problem, a story repeated so often and so warmly that it's become one of the most cherished pieces of Woodstock folklore, and yet one that turns out to be considerably harder to actually verify than most people assume. For decades, the idea that at least one baby was born on the festival grounds itself has circulated as an established, heartwarming fact, occasionally even framed as a kind of symbolic counterbalance to the deaths that also occurred that weekend. The reality, as best as historians and journalists have been able to piece together, is considerably less certain. The festival's own medical director at the time told reporters there were two births connected to the event, one involving a woman flown by helicopter to a nearby hospital where she gave birth shortly after arriving, and another involving a woman who went into labor in a car trapped in the traffic gridlock outside the grounds. Neither birth appears to have happened on the festival site itself, in the mud, in front of the stage, the way the popular version of the story often implies. Journalists in the years since, including a well publicized nationwide search by a major news organization looking for any verified Woodstock baby, have been unable to locate confirmed birth records definitively tying any child's birth to the festival grounds, even as individual people have periodically come forward over the decades claiming the title for themselves. There's a sadder, quieter statistic connected to this part of the story, too, one that gets far less attention than either the births or the two confirmed deaths. Local health officials recorded 8 miscarriages among festival attendees over the course of that same weekend, likely connected to the physical toll of the conditions so many people were enduring: the exhaustion, the exposure, the lack of reliable food, water, and shelter across 3 demanding days. None of this is meant to overshadow what was, for the overwhelming majority of the several 100,000 people present, a genuinely safe, if exhausting, weekend. The vast majority of attendees went home with nothing worse than a cut foot, a head cold, and a story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. But part of telling this history honestly means making room for the small number of people for whom Woodstock wasn't simply peace and music. It was the last weekend of their lives, or a loss they carried quietly home with them, folded in among all the joy that surrounded it. When the last of the crowd finally cleared out of Bethel, the 4 young men who'd organized Woodstock were left facing a financial catastrophe considerably larger than anything they'd walked into the weekend expecting. The math was brutal, and it started with the ticket revenue that had almost entirely failed to materialize once the fences came down and the festival became, for practical purposes, free. Against that near total loss of expected income sat a mountain of costs that had ballooned wildly past the original budget. Performer fees alone reportedly reached somewhere in the neighborhood of $300,000 once every act was paid what they'd been contractually promised, with Jimi Hendrix's fee alone landing around $18,000, comfortably the largest single payment on the list. Add to that the cost of renting Yazgur's farmland, the emergency helicopters ferrying in performers, food and medical supplies, the makeshift medical operation treating thousands of patients, and the sheer expense of trying to manage infrastructure for a crowd many times larger than anything budgeted for, and the organizers found themselves finishing the weekend well over $1 million in debt. Some accounts place the figure closer to 1.5 million at a time when that kind of debt carried enormous weight. The reckoning didn't stop with the balance sheet. In the months following the festival, Woodstock Ventures, the company the four organizers had formed, faced a wave of lawsuits, the majority filed by local farmers and residents seeking compensation for property damage, trampled land, and general disruption caused by the sudden overwhelming crowd. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 80 separate legal claims were eventually filed against the organizers. One farmer reportedly sought damages over a claim that his cows had stopped producing milk, normally in the aftermath of the commotion. Cleanup of the festival grounds alone, once the crowd had gone, required a significant additional outlay of money and labor, adding yet another expense onto a ledger that was already deeply in the red. Max Yasker, who hadn't organized the festival but had simply agreed to rent out his land, ended up bearing a disproportionate share of the community's resentment in the months that followed, despite having far less actual control over how the weekend unfolded than the four organizers who'd planned it. Signs had already gone up around the area during the run up to the festival, urging neighbors to boycott his dairy products. That hostility didn't fully evaporate once the festival ended. If anything, the visible scale of the disruption gave his critics more to point to. Some residents reportedly went as far as threatening him directly. His farmland itself had been left genuinely damaged by the sheer volume of foot traffic, vehicles, and makeshift camping it had absorbed over 3 days, and the organizers were later required to pay him additional compensation beyond his original rental fee, specifically to cover that damage. Not everyone in the community turned against him, and at least one group of supportive neighbors eventually organized a dinner in his honor, specifically to make clear that the hostility wasn't universal. But by most accounts, the personal toll of the backlash stayed with him for years afterward, and those closest to him would later describe him as reluctant for the rest of his life to revisit the subject of how some of his neighbors had treated him over what he'd always maintained was simply an act of hospitality toward a generation of young people he didn't think deserved the suspicion aimed at them. Yazgur, who had already been managing serious heart problems before the festival even took place, sold his farm within a couple of years and relocated to Florida, where he died of a heart attack in 1973, only in his 50s. In a detail that speaks to how seriously the wider music world had come to regard him by that point, a major music magazine ran a full obituary in his honor. an unusual gesture for a publication typically focused on musicians, extended instead to a dairy farmer whose only real involvement in the festival had been renting out his land, and when it mattered, standing up for the people using it. The financial disaster that had crushed Woodstock Ventures in the immediate aftermath didn't turn out to be permanent, though it took time to resolve. The organizers moved quickly to produce a documentary film capturing the festival, released the following year, and it became a genuine commercial and critical success, generating enough revenue between the film and its accompanying soundtrack album to eventually pay off the debts and legal settlements that had piled up in the festival's wake. What had nearly bankrupted four young promoters in August of 1969 had within a couple of years become financially viable again, not through the festival itself, which lost money on a staggering scale, but through the retelling of it, packaged and sold to an audience far larger than the one that had actually stood in the mud at Bethel. Not every account of Woodstock, even as it was still unfolding, arrived at the same conclusion about what the festival actually was. Perhaps nowhere is that shift more visible than in how one of the country's most influential newspapers covered the event in the span of just a few days. As reports of the traffic jams, the mud, the overwhelmed sanitation, and the sheer scale of the crowd began reaching editors in New York City midway through the weekend, the initial editorial reaction from at least one major paper was sharply critical, framing the unfolding chaos in Bethel as a cautionary tale about permissiveness, poor planning, and a younger generation's disregard for order and consequence. It read, in tone, if not in every specific detail, like a story about a disaster in progress. Hundreds of thousands of young people stranded on impassable roads, a town overwhelmed, a weekend teetering on the edge of genuine catastrophe. Within a day or two, as more complete reporting reached the same newsroom, accounts from journalists actually on the ground, describing not just the hardship, but the remarkable cooperation and generosity holding the crowd together despite it, the tone shifted noticeably. A follow up piece emphasized the low rate of violence, the spontaneous acts of shared food and shelter, the largely peaceful exodus once the festival wound down, painting a considerably more sympathetic picture than the newspaper's own initial reaction just days earlier. It's a genuinely striking reversal to trace, precisely because it happened so quickly and so openly within the pages of a single publication still actively covering a story that hadn't even finished happening yet. This kind of rapid, visible flip wasn't unique to any one outlet. Local coverage from the newspaper closest to the actual event told a similarly evolving story. Initial alarm about the scale of the crowd and the strain on local resources, gradually giving way to reporting that emphasized the community's improvised generosity and the crowd's own surprising restraint, even as the practical hardships never really let up. One local paper, the only daily publication with a phone line actually running out of the festival site itself, relied on a motorcyclist to physically ferry photographs and handwritten stories more than 30 miles back to its offices, just to keep the presses running with anything resembling real time coverage of an event that was overwhelming every normal channel of communication available at the time. It's worth sitting with what this reversal actually reveals, because it says something important about how quickly and how thoroughly a single dominant narrative can take hold, even when the reality on the ground was messier and more contested than either the initial panic or the later celebration fully captured. The version of Woodstock that survived into popular memory, 3 days of peace and music, a triumph of countercultural goodwill over adversity, won out over the initial framing of the same event as a dangerous, out of control disaster, not because one version was simply true and the other simply false, but because enough journalists, as editors, and eventually filmmakers converged on the more redemptive story. And that was the version that got repeated, reprinted, and eventually turned into the cultural shorthand the whole country still uses today. The local, longer term relationship between the press and the town of Bethel tells a slightly different, more complicated version of this same story. While national coverage largely settled into the celebratory narrative within days, local papers continued reporting on the genuine friction the festival had caused for months and years afterward. The lawsuits, the damaged farmland, the resentment simmering among residents who'd had their community overrun with essentially no warning or say in the matter. That version of the story, less flattering and less easily condensed into a single triumphant headline, never traveled nearly as far or as fast as the more mythic account that the wider country ultimately embraced. There's a pattern worth carrying forward from this particular thread of the story, one that connects directly to so much of what we've already spent tonight exploring. Almost every major institution that touched Woodstock in its immediate aftermath, the national press, the local press, the festival's own organizers scrambling to salvage their finances through a documentary film, ended up, in one way or another, participating in the construction of a cleaner, more mythic version of what had actually happened. Not through outright dishonesty, necessarily, but through the ordinary editorial instinct to find the clearest, most compelling version of a complicated story and led with that one. The chaos was real. The generosity was real. But it was the generosity, retold and repeated enough times by enough different outlets, that eventually crowded almost everything else out of how the country would remember that muddy weekend in Bethel. When the last performer finally left the stage on Monday morning, what remained behind was, by nearly every first-hand description, a genuine disaster zone. Acres of trampled, rain-soaked farmland buried under a staggering amount of trash, abandoned tents, discarded clothing, empty containers, and the accumulated debris of several 100,000 people who had been living outdoors with minimal facilities for the better part of 4 days. The cleanup itself became its own small, unexpected chapter in the festival's story. Rather than simply abandoning the site the moment the music stopped, a group estimated at around 8,000 attendees voluntarily stayed behind after the festival officially ended, spending additional time helping clear the grounds before finally heading home themselves. Their efforts, combined with a further professional cleanup operation the organizers funded at a cost of roughly $100,000, turned out to be thorough enough that decades later, archaeologists conducting a careful excavation of the original festival site found remarkably little physical evidence left behind, mostly small fragments of glass and pull tabs from aluminum cans, rather than anything close to the scale of debris you might expect from an event of that size. The goodwill of those 8,000 volunteers, though, didn't extend very far into how the surrounding community felt about what had just happened to their town. In the weeks and months that followed, Bethel's residents made their frustration clear through more than just lawsuits. Local farmers reportedly spread manure across sections of their land specifically to discourage curious visitors from wandering onto their property in the aftermath. On at least one anniversary of the festival, local residents and police set up an informal roadblock to keep any nostalgic pilgrims from showing up unannounced. The town's supervisor at the time, who'd played a role in approving the permits that allowed the festival to happen in Bethel in the first place, lost his bid for re election that November by what accounts describe as a narrow margin, a result widely understood as a direct response to the disruption the festival had brought to the community. The state government responded with policy changes of its own. New York's legislature, along with the town of Bethel specifically, enacted new mass gathering laws in the aftermath, explicitly designed to prevent anything resembling Woodstock's scale from happening again without far stricter oversight and planning requirements. For years afterward, Bethel actively resisted any association with the festival that had briefly, chaotically, made it one of the most talked about places in the country. It would take decades before the town's relationship with its own history began to soften. That shift eventually came in the form of the Bethel Woods Center for the Arts, built directly on and around the original festival site after a cable television entrepreneur purchased the land specifically to preserve and eventually develop it. The center opened in 2006, nearly 40 years after the festival itself, anchored by a newly built performance pavilion located a short distance from where the original stage once stood. A museum dedicated specifically to the history and cultural significance of the 1969 festival followed a couple of years later, transforming a site the town had spent decades trying to distance itself from into a deliberately preserved piece of local and national history. The field where the original stage stood remains open today, marked only by a modest commemorative plaque, a quiet, almost understated marker for a weekend that reshaped how an entire generation and the decades of American culture that followed it would think about music, community, and chaos held loosely together by nothing more than the goodwill of the people living through it. It's a strange kind of ending for a story this large. A farm that briefly became one of the most populous places in New York State, resented by its own neighbors for years afterward, quietly cleaned up by thousands of the very people who'd helped overwhelm it in the first place, and eventually, decades later, turned into the exact kind of preserved cultural landmark that the town spent so long trying to avoid becoming. Max Yasgur never got to see that final chapter. He'd already passed away, still carrying the weight of a community's resentment, more than 3 decades before Bethel finally fully made peace with what had happened on his farm. If you've stayed with us this far, you're probably somewhere close to sleep by now, and that feels like the right place to let this story rest. Think back to where we started tonight. A highway that was never actually closed, a recording studio that quietly turned into the largest concert most of the country had ever seen. Almost nothing about Woodstock went the way anyone planned it. The fences failed, the food ran out, the toilets overflowed within the first day. The schedule collapsed so completely that its most famous performance happened on a Monday morning to a field that was already mostly empty. And through all of it, people who had never met each other kept sharing what little they had, kept helping strangers find their footing on a muddy hillside, kept choosing again and again generosity over panic. Both of those things are true at once, and that might be the most honest thing this whole story has to offer. Woodstock really was chaotic, underprepared, and in places genuinely dangerous, a financial disaster for the people who organized it, a serious hardship for the community that hosted it, and, for a small handful of families, a weekend that ended in real loss rather than a story to tell for the rest of their lives. And Woodstock really was, for most of the several 100,000 people who made it out of the traffic and into that field, something close to what the legend has always claimed. 3 days where strangers mostly chose to take care of each other under conditions that gave them every reason not to. 50 some years later, almost everyone who was actually there has a slightly different memory of what happened, shaped by where they were standing, which acts they managed to see, how deep the mud was wherever they'd set up camp. The neat, single version of Woodstock that gets repeated in documentaries and textbooks was built afterward, stitched together from the clearest footage and the best stories, smoothing over just how uncertain and disorganized the whole thing felt while it was actually happening. That's true of almost every legendary moment in history, if you look closely enough. The story that survives is rarely the whole story. It's just the version that was easiest to tell. Let that be the last thought you carry into sleep tonight. Somewhere on a quiet, empty field in upstate New York, the mud has long since dried, the crowds have long since gone home, and all that's left is a small plaque and a story that keeps getting simpler every time someone tells it. If you drifted off somewhere in the middle of this one, that's exactly what it was made for. You can always come back and pick up the thread another night. And if you're somehow still awake, thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of a night that covered a lot more ground than the postcard version of this story usually does. If this kind of slow, immersive history helps you sleep, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making more of it. We'll see you in the next one. Rest easy, sleep well. This is Drowsy History.